The left is like a bad magician running out of tricks, grasping at everything to keep the audience distracted. Their latest sleight of hand, January 6th. They're still clinging to this tired narrative, milking it for all it's worth while conveniently forgetting the chaos they endorsed during the George Floyd riots. Remember those? Cities burned, businesses were looted, and the response was applause and hashtags. But now we're supposed to believe they're the guardians of law and order. Give me a break. It's hypocrisy on full display, and they don't even bother hiding it anymore. Now let's get to the meat of it, because apparently language is violence now, intentions are actions, and zip ties are weapons of mass destruction. Oh, and let's not forget the grand historical comparison game. January 6th, right up there with World War II and the Holocaust, apparently. What's next? Ranking it higher than the moon landing? The clips we're going to watch today are a masterclass in melodrama, moral gymnastics, and just the right sprinkling of self-righteous indignation. So buckle up, because we're about to unpack the contradictions and crocodile tears with a side of unapologetic reality check. Starting with the bullet America collectively dodged, the soon-to-be former Vice President Kamala Harris, one of those Democrats who cheered on the destruction of American cities during the George Floyd riots, now virtue signaling to us that she's a different kind of politician when it comes to the peaceful transfer of power.
Today at the United States Capitol, I will perform my constitutional duty as Vice President of the United States to certify the results of the 2024 election. This duty is a sacred obligation, one I will uphold, guided by love of country, loyalty to our Constitution, and my unwavering faith in the American people. As we have seen, our democracy can be fragile, and it is up to then each one of us to stand up for our most cherished principles and to make sure that in America, our government always remains of the people, by the people, and for the people.
You got to give Kamala Harris props when props are deserved. She has a knack for wrapping political opportunism in lofty rhetoric, and her speech on the peaceful transfer of power is no exception. She paints January 6th as an existential threat to democracy, a sacred duty defiled, and yet when riots erupted across America during the summer of 2020, she was singing a very different tune. Let's remind ourselves of her infamous tweet from January 1st, 2020, saying, "If you're able to, chip in now to the Minnesota Freedom Fund to help post bail for those protesting on the ground in Minnesota." That fund didn't just assist peaceful protesters, it helped release individuals charged with serious crimes, including arson and assault. According to a report by Fox News, one individual bailed out by the fund was later charged with assaulting a 71-year-old man. Now let's talk numbers, because Harris's selective outrage needs context. The George Floyd riots caused an estimated $2 billion in damages, making them the most expensive civil unrest in U.S. history, as reported by the Insurance Information Institute. At least 25 people lost their lives, and entire city blocks were burned to the ground. Contrast this with the Capitol riot, which, while disgraceful, resulted in $2.7 million in damages, according to a Government Accountability Office report. Both events were destructive and unacceptable, but the scale and scope of devastation during the 2020 riots far eclipsed what happened on January 6th. What's more, Harris has consistently framed the 2020 riots as a justified expression of anger. She even told Stephen Colbert in June 2020 that the protests were not going to stop, and they should not. Yet here she is, clutching pearls over the events of January 6th, labeling it a unique affront to democracy. The hypocrisy is staggering. When businesses burned and lives were destroyed during the George Floyd riots, she endorsed the chaos with a smile. But when her own political opposition causes damage, it suddenly becomes an unparalleled act of evil. And let's not forget her flawed reasoning. Harris claims January 6th was an attack on democracy because of its intent to overturn an election. Fair enough. But what about the mobs in Portland that attacked a federal courthouse nightly for months? Or the Chaz Chop Zone in Seattle, where an autonomous zone rejected federal authority entirely? By her own logic, these actions should also qualify as assaults on democracy, but she never condemned them with the same fervor. Why? Because they aligned with her political narrative. But let's go a step further and take a closer look at what really happened on January 6th beyond the carefully curated narrative. The day saw a mix of chaos and coordinated efforts, but there are glaring inconsistencies that demand scrutiny. Video evidence and witness accounts show Capitol Police officers standing aside and even waving some protesters into the building. Former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund testified that his requests for additional support were ignored in the days leading up to the event. Meanwhile, questions linger about the FBI's involvement. According to reports from the New York Times, FBI informants were embedded in the crowd, raising concerns about whether federal agencies knew more than they let on, or worse, contributed to the escalating situation. Now, the destruction that day included broken windows, vandalized offices, and damage estimated at $2.7 million. Yet compared to devastation during the George Floyd riots, the physical toll was far less severe. More concerning are the stories of individuals arrested in the aftermath of January 6th. People like Jacob Chansley, the so-called QAnon shaman, were handed disproportionately harsh sentences despite his nonviolent actions and a lack of prior criminal history. Others like Richard Barnett were charged for merely trespassing while being denied basic due process rights, including bail for extended periods. According to the Epoch Times, many defendants have languished in pretrial detention for years, held under conditions more fitting for violent criminals than those accused of property crimes. It's a stark contrast to the treatment of individuals during the 2020 riots, many of whom were released within hours or had charges dropped entirely. If this is justice, it's a justice system that's decided your politics matter more than your actions. Thus, it's creating a whole class of political prisoners. This level of dishonesty isn't just hypocritical, it's calculated. It's about projecting virtue while selectively amplifying outrage to fit a political narrative. Supporting violent riots one year and condemning them the next isn't a shift in principle, it's moral convenience masquerading as righteousness. By framing January 6th as an unparalleled assault on democracy while downplaying or outright endorsing the destruction during the George Floyd riots, figures like Kamala Harris aren't standing up for justice. They're exploiting selective outrage to virtue signal, all while eroding public trust in their sincerity and the very principles they claim to uphold. And speaking of dishonesty, let's look at what Chuck Schumer had to say in this day of remembrance.
In just accordance with your prayer, we remember all of those who were hurt, even lost their lives as a result of what happened on January 6th, 4 years ago, 2021, and pray for them and their...
Now, Chuck Schumer's latest performance is exactly that, a masterclass in political theater. He starts by solemnly asking us to remember all those who were hurt, even lost their lives as a result of what happened on January 6th. Sounds heartfelt, except it's about as honest as a used car salesman promising you low mileage. Let's fact check this emotional appeal. Who exactly lost their lives on January 6th? According to the Washington Post, the only person directly killed during the riot was Ashley Babbitt, an unarmed protester shot by Capitol Police. That's not exactly the narrative Schumer wants you to remember. And then there's the myth of Officer Brian Sicknick being killed by the mob. The medical examiner confirmed, according to the New York Times, that Sicknick died the next day from strokes unrelated to any injuries sustained during the riot. An inconvenient truth for Schumer's drama. But hey, why let facts get in the way of a good story? And let's not forget the tragic suicides of 4 officers in the months after January 6th. According to The Guardian, while these suicides are undeniably heartbreaking, there's no evidence they were directly caused by the riot itself. Schumer and his allies lumped these deaths into the January 6th body count hoax like padding an expense report, hoping no one will notice the overreach. If this is about honoring lives lost, why twist the truth into knots? Because for Schumer, January 6th isn't just an event, it's a political cash cow. Now let's talk about what Schumer doesn't mention. He skips over the Capitol Police waving protesters inside as shown in widely circulated video footage reported by Reuters. He ignores the New York Times reporting on FBI informants embedded in the crowd, raising questions about the extent of federal knowledge and involvement in the day's events. And he's completely silent on the numerous security failures that leadership, his team included, had a hand in. These aren't footnotes. They're the gaping holes in his story that make the whole thing fall apart.
We hope also we serve as an example to our Republican colleagues. We are not election deniers. We lost the election, we regret it, but we believe in the strength of our democracy and that when you lose an election, you roll up your sleeves and try to win the next one. You don't deny that you lost and encourage people to do bad, bad things because you did not want to admit, any person did not want to admit that they had lost the election, even though the facts were overwhelming.
Now let's dissect Schumer's self-congratulatory attempt at rewriting history, because this is pure political gaslighting wrapped in a smug little bow. He wants us to believe Democrats are paragons of democratic virtue, standing tall as shining examples for their Republican colleagues. We are not election deniers, he says, with a conviction of someone who thinks we've all forgotten about the last 2 decades of Democrat rhetoric. Let's rewind to 2016. When Donald Trump won the presidency, did Democrats graciously concede defeat? Not quite. Instead, we got years of Russia collusion hysteria, with prominent Democrats, including Hillary Clinton, repeatedly referring to Trump as an illegitimate president. According to the Washington Post, a 2017 poll found that 2/3 of Democrats believed Russian interference had changed vote tallies, a claim completely debunked by subsequent investigations. But Schumer conveniently forgets that his side was peddling election denial before they started claiming it was a Republican trend. And let's not ignore Stacey Abrams, the self-proclaimed governor of Georgia, who spent years refusing to concede her 2018 gubernatorial race to Brian Kemp. According to the New York Times, Abrams alleged voter suppression without substantial evidence and turned her non-concession into a political brand. Where was Chuck Schumer's sermon about the strength of our democracy then? Oh, right, it's only bad when the other side does it. Now, Schumer's appeal to overwhelming facts is particularly rich. Does he mean the same overwhelming fact Democrats ignored when objecting to the certification of electoral college votes in 2000, 2004, and 2016? According to Politico, House Democrats challenged George W. Bush's win in 2004, claiming irregularities in Ohio. And let's not forget Senator Barbara Boxer's objection during the 2005 certification process. Funny how Schumer skips over these inconvenient truths in his moral lecture. Schumer's accusation that Republicans alone have sown division is not only hypocritical, but demonstrably false. The Democrat Party's persistent challenges to Trump's legitimacy after the 2016 election played a significant role in deepening national divides. According to a Pew Research Center study in 2019, partisan polarization surged during Trump's presidency, with 85% of Democrats consistently disapproving of him, a stark contrast to the levels of polarization seen under previous administrations. This polarization was fueled in part by Democrat leaders repeatedly questioning the validity of Trump's presidency, with Hillary Clinton famously calling him an illegitimate president during a 2019 CBS interview. Schumer's argument is nothing more than projection and selective outrage. By painting Democrats as virtuous defenders of democracy and Republicans as sore losers, he ignores his own party's history of election denial, inflammatory rhetoric, and tacit approval of violence when it suits their agenda. If we're going to talk about rolling up sleeves to win the next election, maybe Chuck should start by rolling up the rug where he's been sweeping all this hypocrisy. Until then, his moralizing rings hollow. And speaking of intellectual black holes, Sunny Hostin's January 6th commentary on The View could make you reconsider euthanasia as a public service.
I think we need to find moral clarity, in this country. And I just remember after January 6th, you had someone like Mitch McConnell placing the blame on January 6th where it belonged, squarely on Donald Trump's shoulders. And then you started seeing people backtrack that and losing their moral center. You had Condoleezza Rice, I believe, on this very show saying, we need to move on from January 6th. I say no. You don't move on, because January 6th was an atrocity. It was one of the worst moments in American history. And when you think about the worst moments in American history, like World War II, things that happened, like the Holocaust, chattel slavery, we need to never forget, because past becomes prologue if you forget any race.
Let's unpack Sunny Hostin's latest attempt to elevate January 6th to the pantheon of historical atrocities, because this is peak The View, pure moral posturing and logical incoherence. According to Hostin, January 6th was one of the worst moments in American history, worthy of comparison to events like World War II, the Holocaust, and chattel slavery. Really, Sunny? January 6th, with its $2.7 million in damages and a single direct fatality, now belongs alongside global genocide and centuries of systemic oppression. This kind of rhetorical inflation doesn't just strain credibility, it shreds it. Hostin begins by invoking moral clarity, but immediately undermines her argument by cherry-picking facts and context to suit her narrative. She applauds Mitch McConnell for blaming Donald Trump, conveniently ignoring that McConnell later criticized the Democrats for exploiting January 6th for political gain. According to Political, McConnell has repeatedly condemned Trump's role in the riot, but he also emphasized the importance of due process and the need to avoid political grandstanding. Hostin's selective quoting is less about clarity and more about crafting a partisan caricature. And then there's her fixation on Condoleezza Rice's suggestion that we need to move on. Rice wasn't advocating for ignoring January 6th, but for focusing on actionable steps to prevent future incidents. Hostin distorts this into a callous dismissal, misrepresenting a nuanced argument for the sake of outrage. According to Rice herself, as reported in the Washington Post, her statement was about ensuring that January 6th doesn't become a perpetual political weapon rather than a moment for reflection and improvement. But nuance doesn't get ratings, does it? Now, the most egregious part of Hostin's tirade is her historical comparison. By placing January 6th alongside the Holocaust and slavery, she trivializes genuine human suffering to score rhetorical points. The riot, as chaotic as it was, cannot be reasonably equated with genocidal campaigns or institutionalized oppression. Hostin's use of the phrase past becomes prologue is ironic given her selective memory. She calls January 6th an atrocity but glosses over other significant events like the 2017 congressional baseball shooting, where a politically motivated gunman opened fire on Republican lawmakers, critically injuring Steve Scalise. According to the Washington Post, the shooter was a Bernie bro who specifically targeted Republicans, yet this act of politically motivated violence rarely gets the same level of condemnation or endless analysis. Why isn't she calling that event an atrocity? The answer is simple. It doesn't fit her narrative. Hostin's moral clarity is nothing more than moral convenience. If Hostin truly believes in learning from history, then honesty and consistency are essential. Instead, she resorts to hyperbole and selective outrage, undermining her credibility and turning January 6th into a rhetorical prop rather than a moment of clarity. This isn't about moral clarity, it's about moral theater, and the audience deserves better. And coming up next, is it even a political discussion if we don't get a dose of Joy Reid's signature blend of ignorance and overconfidence? Let's check it out.
Hey guys, it's Joy. So a lot of you guys have been asking on the socials what my earrings are. And yes, they are fabulous. Here they are. They are elephant earrings. And the elephant is significant for a couple of reasons. Of course, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated symbol is the elephant. But the significance of me wearing them today is that elephants never forget. And today is January 6th. 2025, 4 years since the January 6th insurrection, and we, Americans who actually care about democracy and the real peaceful transfer of power, not coups and insurrections, we will never forget. That is the significance of the earrings today.
Okay, let's talk about Joy Reid's latest masterstroke of unintentional irony. First off, the elephant earrings. Elephants, as she so thoughtfully explains, symbolize Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And also, according to her, the idea that elephants never forget. But let's not forget the glaringly obvious. Elephants are also the symbol of the Republican Party. So here's Joy Reid wearing GOP symbolism while delivering a lecture on January 6th, ostensibly pulling a move so clueless it could only be described as a real donkey, her party's mascot, by the way. You couldn't script this kind of irony. Now let's break down her statement that we Americans who actually care about democracy will never forget. Really, Joy? The people who spent 4 years refusing to accept the results of the 2016 election, peddling Russia collusion conspiracies, and labeling a duly elected president illegitimate are now lecturing us about respecting democracy? As we saw earlier, a majority of Democrats believed in the Russia hoaxes, despite there being no evidence to support any of those claims. So much for actually caring about democracy. Joy's framing of January 6th as an insurrection is equally overblown. Yes, it was a chaotic and disgraceful day, but as the Wall Street Journal reported, the vast majority of participants didn't even enter the Capitol, and those who did were overwhelmingly charged with non-violent offenses like trespassing. Comparing this to an actual insurrection is like calling a parking ticket a federal crime. Reid and her ilk inflate the narrative because it's politically convenient, not because it's accurate. And let's not miss the elephant-sized hypocrisy in the room. Joy Reid belongs to the same Democrat establishment that conveniently forgets the politically motivated violence committed by her side. Take the summer of 2018, where Democrat politicians and activists openly harassed Trump administration officials in public spaces, with Maxine Waters famously telling supporters to create a crowd and push on them. According to the Washington Post, this rhetoric led to several incidents of mob-like confrontations, including DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen being forced out of a restaurant and Sarah Huckabee Sanders being refused service. While not as overtly violent as January 6th, this behavior normalized hostility and encouraged a culture of aggression. But it doesn't get the same level of dramatic introspection. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative Reid is so desperate to perpetuate. All in all, Joy Reid's performance here isn't just ironic, it's emblematic of the modern left's strategy. Weaponize selective memory, inflate moral outrage, and cloak it all in self-righteous symbolism. The earrings might be elephants, but the message is pure donkey. Now, I don't have to tell you the Democrat Party's relationship with violence is a study in convenience. When it serves their agenda, they'll downplay destruction, excuse riots, or call it the voice of the unheard. When it doesn't, they'll inflate incidents, rewrite history, and wield moral outrage like a club. Their dishonesty isn't a bug, it's a feature. They'll twist narratives, omit context, and project blame, all to seize the moral high ground and manipulate the conversation. But why? Because their party isn't built on shared principles or consistent values. It's built on whatever feels like progress in the moment, whatever aligns with the emotional pitch of the current debate. They're not leaders with convictions. They're actors waiting for the right playwright to hand them a script, eager to deliver lines that keep the spotlight on them. And January 6th, that's just the current show they got on the road. But here's my question. How much longer will this play go on before the audience sees right through it? How many times can they flip-flop on violence before people start asking why they only care when it's politically advantageous? If Democrats are so concerned about democracy, why do they undermine it with selective outrage and divisive rhetoric? If their values shift with the political wind, what are they actually even fighting for? And here's the big one. Do they really believe what they're saying, or are they just looking for the next round of applause? It's up to you to decide if you're buying their performance or if it's time to demand leaders who actually stand for something, not just whatever's trending that day. Anyway, folks, thank you so much for watching. Tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.